Hub History, the show that brings you fascinating stories from Boston history. This is episode 31. Hi, I'm Jake, and I'm sorry to say that this week, co-host Nikki won't be joining me. With this episode being released on Memorial Day weekend, we just weren't able to set aside time to get a full episode recorded together. However, we didn't want you to have to go a whole week without hearing from us, so it's time to take a look at what's coming up this week in Boston history. Monday is May 29th, and on May 29th, 1917, in a nice, but not lavish, 9-room colonial revival house on Beale Street in Brookline, a baby boy was born. His mother had been born in a tenement house in Boston's North End and raised in Dorchester. Her father, longtime Mayor Honey Fitzgerald, didn't approve of her young suitor, so their courtship stretched over 7 years. Eventually, the suitor, Joseph P. Kennedy, bought the Beale Street house in 1914, and the couple was then wed. The child who was born in the second-floor master bedroom would go on to a prominent career. He would attend Harvard, serve with distinction in the U.S. Navy during World War II, get elected to the U.S. Senate, write a book, and eventually go on to be our 35th president. Happy 100th birthday to John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you.
Thomas Prince's Chronological History of New England records the arrival of a group of English settlers in the Charles River Valley on May 30th, 1630. This was about 1 month before Boston founder John Winthrop and his fleet arrived. May 30th. Mr. Wareham, Maverick, Rossiter, and Ludlow arrive at Nantasket. Captain Squebb puts them and their goods on shore at Nantasket Point and leaves them to shift for themselves. But getting a boat of some old planters, they lader with goods, and some able men well armed go up to Charlestown, where we find some wigwams, some few English, and one house, with an old planter who can speak Indian. We go up Charles River until it grows narrow and shallow, there with much labor land our goods, the bank being steep. At night we are told of 300 Indians hard by, but our planter going and desiring them not to come near us, they comply. Our captain is Mr. Southcott, a brave low-country soldier, but we not above 10 in number. In the morning some of the natives stand at a distance looking at us, but come not near until they had been a while in view, and then one of them holding out a bass toward us, we send a man with a biscuit and change them. After which they supply us with bass, giving a bass for a biscuit, and are very friendly. And by our diligence we get up a shelter to save our goods, but are not there many days before we have orders to come away from this place, which is after called Watertown, to Mattapan, because there is a neck fit to keep our cattle on. So we remove to Mattapan, begin the town, name it Dorchester, and here the natives are also kind to us. Wednesday is May 31st. The Boston neighborhood I call home is Reedville, which is as far south and west as you can go and still be in the city of Boston. On a stretch of land along the Neponset River, where there's now a grocery warehouse and a motorcycle riding school, the last stock car race in Reedville was held on May 31st, 1937. The racetrack in Reedville was originally built as the Reedville Trotting Park in 1896, at the height of the harness racing craze. Around the same time, you could take in a race at Beacon Park in Allston, the Dorchester Gentlemen's Driving Club, Franklin Field Speedway, or the Charles River Speedway in Brighton. Reedville had a mile-long dirt track built on the remains of Camp Meigs, which was an army base that trained soldiers for service in the Civil War. The Reedville Trotting Park made a successful switch to gas burners, with the first auto race held in 1903. Known then as the Reedville Racetrack, it could attract over 12,000 people on a holiday weekend. In the early years, they'd turn out to watch electric cars, steam cars, and even motorized bicycles. The first recorded stock car race in history was held there in 1906, and soon that sport was all the rage. By the late 1920s, harness racing had fallen by the wayside, and stock cars ruled the day. The track was given a harder surface and steeply banked turns to accommodate higher speeds. The top drivers of the era competed there until the 1930s, when the track went into decline. After that final race on May 31st, 1937, the track was largely abandoned, though it was sometimes used by Navy pilots to practice touch-and-go landings during World War II. Today, a small plaque is all that remains. We'll post photos of exciting race action at Reedville from Boston Public Library in this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/031. There's a persistent national myth that says the early settlers of New England, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, came to America in order to establish religious freedom. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Puritans who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony came here in order to freely practice their own religion, but had no tolerance for other faiths. When the Society of Friends, commonly known as the Quaker Church, began to become popular, the colony passed laws banishing any Quaker from its borders in 1656, and additional penalties were added in 1658 if they had the nerve to come back and attempt to spread their views. It was enacted that any Quaker, after the first conviction, if a man, should lose one of his ears. If a woman, should be severely whipped. For the second offense should, if a man, have his other ear cut off. If a woman, should receive another severe whipping. For the third, whether man or woman, should have the tongue bored through with a red-hot iron. Even these severities, however, being found insufficient to eradicate the obnoxious sect, it was at last enacted that every Quaker returning to the country after banishment should be put to death. Mary Dyer had been a very early settler in Boston, settling here with her husband William and an infant son in 1635. However, she became entangled in the antinomian controversy and was banished from the colony in 1638. For more on this clash, listen to our episode on Catherine Nanny Naylor, as her family was also banished at the same time. The Dyers moved to the more tolerant colony of Rhode Island, then spent several years in England. While she was in England, Mary Dyer became a practicing Quaker. The Quakers embraced radical beliefs such as the spiritual equality of women and the separation of church and state. They renounced prayer, baptism, and ordination of ministers. And they became extreme pacifists, refusing to fight in any war. When she returned to New England in 1657, Mary Dyer landed at Boston, where she was recognized as a Quaker and imprisoned. William came to bail her out, and they had to swear to never return and not to sleep in any town or speak to any person in Massachusetts as they made their way back to Rhode Island. Two of her friends and fellow Quaker activists were imprisoned in Boston in 1659, after the statute was updated to include banishment on penalty of death. Dyer went to Boston to stand in solidarity with them and was immediately arrested. All three were sentenced to death. Governor Endicott would say, "We have made many laws and endeavored in several ways to keep you from among us, but neither whipping, nor imprisonment, nor cutting off ears, nor banishment upon pain of death will keep you from among us. We desire not your death. Mary Dyer, you shall go from hence to the place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, and there be hanged till you be dead." Dyer replied, "The will of the Lord be done, and joyfully I go." A week later, the three Quakers were led to the place of execution on Boston Neck. One by one, William Robinson and Marmaduke Stevenson were hanged to death. As Mary Dyer was about to climb the gallows, she was given a last-minute reprieve and returned to Rhode Island. Nevertheless, she persisted. Mary Dyer was intent on forcing a reckoning with the Puritan authorities, so that they would be forced to either relax the ban on Quakers or put a woman to death. In May of 1660, she returned to Boston and was again imprisoned. On June 1st, 1660, Mary Dyer was executed. As she mounted the gallows, the executioner said that she was guilty of her own blood. She replied, "Nay, I came to keep blood guiltiness from you, desiring you to repeal the unrighteous and unjust law of banishment upon pain of death, made against the innocent servants of the Lord. Therefore my blood will be required at your hands who willfully do it. But for those that do is in the simplicity of their hearts, I do desire the Lord to forgive them. I came to do the will of my Father, and in obedience to his will I stand even to the death." Asked if she would repent her sins, she said, "Nay, man, I am not now to repent." Friday is June 2nd. June 2nd, 1967 was also a Friday, and on that Friday, about 25 women occupied the Grove Hall office of the Welfare Department along Boston's Blue Hill Avenue. The women belonged to a group that called itself Mothers for Adequate Welfare, and it was their third sit-in at that office in 8 days. They demanded that welfare recipients be treated with dignity, and that recipients be given seats on the governing board of each welfare office. In each of the earlier protests, they'd been forced to leave without having their issues addressed. This time they brought bicycle locks and chained the doors shut as protesters and police gathered outside. An article in the Harvard Crimson describes the police response. Inside the building, the reinforced police rushed the door. James C. Pinney, who was with the mothers, said the police were wielding billy clubs and shouting "kill 'em" as they tried to break up the group of demonstrators who had gathered in front of the doors. In the scuffle, police crashed through the glass doors. In 20 minutes, the police had cleared the building. Many of the demonstrators were beaten and thrown into paddy wagons. They were held for several hours and released on bail. While the police were clearing the building, one of the mothers shouted out of a window, "They're beating our people in here." At that point, the crowd outside rushed the police, who used billy clubs to push them to the other side of Blue Hill Ave, where they broke windows and threw bricks and bottles. For the rest of the night, the crowd faced police along a 15-block strip of Blue Hill Avenue. By early morning, there were 1,000 police, armed with guns, billy clubs, and baseball bats, and about as many demonstrators in the streets of Roxbury. The violence of the evening left Blue Hill Ave in shambles. Storefronts were smashed, apartment windows were broken, businesses looted, 2 buildings were burned. There was sporadic violence in the neighborhood for 2 more days. Mel King's book, Chain of Change, Struggles for Black Community Development, features a chapter on the incident and notes, eventually, to the annoyance of the Boston police, all charges against the quote-unquote rioters were dropped. The incidents, called the police riots by black residents, prompted some answering chords from other groups, and a rally of about 1,000 welfare recipients from across the state was held on the Boston Common several weeks later. In the show notes this week, we'll have pictures and video from the riot, as well as a link to Mel King's book. On June 3, 1776, Harvard College was trying to get back to normal after a year at the heart of the Revolution. When the Continental Army made its headquarters in the part of Cambridge we now call Harvard Square, the college picked up and moved to Concord. Now, they were evaluating what it would take to move back. Resolved, that the committee appointed by this court April 24, 1776, to estimate the damages sustained by Harvard College for the accommodation of the Continental Army and by means of the British forces, and to make such repairs immediately as may be necessary for the comfortable accommodation of the members of said college, be further empowered to estimate the damage sustained by the loss of the kitchen utensils belonging to the said college, which were taken for use of the army, and replace the same immediately, and do such other things as are necessary for re-establishing the college in its former situation, and that the governors of the college have power to remove the apparatus and such part of the library as they think necessary to Cambridge, as soon as they shall judge the college buildings prepared for a removal from Concord, and lay the accounts before this court. Finally, Sunday is June 4th. After a century of sporadic warfare between the French and English colonists in North America, the British seized control of the region known as Acadia from the French during the 7 Years' War. Acadia encompassed much of modern Maine, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and the Canadian Maritime provinces. In a particularly brutal turn of events, British authorities decided to expel the French residents from the colony starting in 1755, and to replace them with English settlers. Almost 12,000 Acadians were deported to points in the 13 English colonies, to France, and to Britain. The 2,000 that were sent to Massachusetts were denied permission to disembark their ships for 4 months, and about half of them died. 5 years later, the effort to repopulate the region with planters from New England began in earnest. As a paper read before the Nova Scotia Historical Society in 1960 said, on June 4, 1760, the Maine flotilla, consisting of 22 ships hired by the government of Nova Scotia to transport the planters to Horton and Cornwallis, rounded the Cape, and anchored in the estuary of the Avon and Gaspereau rivers. It was escorted by a brig of war. Assuming that the vessels were the usual sloops and schooners, of average size, they must have carried an average of 50 passengers each, plus stock and equipment. Ironically, Nova Scotia would be the destination for many British loyalists who were expelled from New England after the American Revolution. If you'd like to learn more about any of our anniversaries this week, check out the show notes at hubhistory.com/031. We'll have pictures, videos, articles, and original sources for all the stories I discussed. Our mention of colonial comics in the show notes last week sparked some discussion among the artists and authors who created that volume. Historian J.L. Bell, who contributes to Colonial Comics, tweeted a link to our show and noted that Colonial Comics also tells the story of the grave-robbing Spunkers Club. Then the editor of the series, Jason Rodriguez, chimed in saying, "Adding this to the list. Hub History's podcast on grave robbing and the Spunkers Club. Laura Innes did a comic on the Spunkers for Colonial Comics." Laura Innes, who illustrated the Spunkers Club comic and several others in that series, said, "Podcast about Boston resurrectionists, including Doctors Joseph and John Warren and the Spunkers Club. Ooh, can't wait to listen. How much research did you do on Levi Ames? Found out so many fascinating things I couldn't fit into the story." Upon learning that we didn't actually fit Levi Ames into our story either, she suggested a future episode on him. If you'd like to suggest a future episode, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. We're at hubhistory on Twitter and at facebook.com/hubhistory. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, we'd love it if you could write us a brief review. It's still the best way to help others find the show. That's all for now. We'll be back next week with a show on The Giggler, Boston's terrifying but forgotten serial killer.